They suspended her after she was smeared, and then her father died, but she had evidence that would change everything. Ana Clara Oliveira arrived in a town that wore its history like a skin, faded signs, a town square that remembered every argument, and a single family whose name opened doors and closed mouths. She stepped off the bus with a duffel that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, eyes already measuring street widths and alleyways, muscles tuned to notice the small, telling things, the way a shopkeeper's hand hesitated over a shutter, the empty benches in front of the municipal building, the particular streak of dust that formed when a truck rolled past. She had been recruited from the city because she noticed differently. In a place that ran on favors and fear, she listened to what people left unsaid. The market was a pulse. Vendors threaded calls over frying oil and fruit stands. A radio spat out a country song from a cracked speaker. Summer heat made the pavement shimmer. Ana Clara moved like a visitor and a detective at once, aware of the rhythms, patient and watchful. She watched faces, not only for what they showed, but for what they avoided. It was how she found her father's old acquaintance, Antonio, arranging cans on a shelf as though no one could read the worry in his posture. Then the town's equilibrium snapped in a line as clean and brutal as a snapped bone. Victor Montenegro stepped into the square like he owned every shadow there. He had the broad, careless walk of someone who expected people to make space for him, a leather jacket with military creases, a laugh that expected participation. He saw Ana Clara the way a man sees a painting and assumes it hangs for his approval. The first exchange was a small, almost cinematic injury, a hand on her lower back as he stepped too close, a remark that named her body where a uniform should have named a person. She told him to remove his hand. He laughed it off, public and guaranteed. When he reached for her again, this time a hand that meant to humiliate in front of the stalls, she slapped him. Not a reflex, a decision. The shock of it landed like thunder. Her palm on his face broke the polite calculus of the square. Voices flicked in two directions, some shocked, some appalled, some waiting to see which way the wind would blow. There was a freeze-frame memory that stayed with half the market, a pair of sunglasses falling into dust, breaking the light, Victor's cigarette dropping and rolling toward a drain. The slap was not loud, but it rearranged the skin of that town. For Ana Clara, it was a claim, I will not be touched without consequence. For Victor, it was an affront to expectation. For others, it was a prize they could exploit. Within hours, the story did what stories in small towns always do. It found amplification. At first, it moved along gossip, who slapped whom, whether Ana Clara had been provoked.
Then a photograph appeared, a doctored tableau that told a different truth. Victor posed with his palm to his cheek, a staged smirk frozen on his face. Ana Clara's uniform looked rumpled and wild in the framing. The local paper's headline did the rest, an accusation made of ink. Officer assaults prominent youth. The article drizzled insinuation like honey. Quotes were stitched in. A local editor said she'd endangered the peace. An unnamed source implied a history of disciplinary issues. The image was clean, the prose clean, the implication devastating. She knew how quickly official machinery moved when the powerful wished it. A call came that evening from the Office of Professional Standards, crisp and bureaucratic, suspended pending investigation. Terms like procedural review and immediate relief from duty filled the air like sterile paper. They collected the badge and her gun. A uniform that had once been an extension of her bones was now a thing to be returned, inspected, compartmentalized. It's standard, the voice said. Pending inquiry. It sounded neutral. It was not. In the 2 days that followed, the town doubled down on its divisions. Men in suits began to be seen at the paper, leaving with quick, worried gestures. A white SUV with a crest, state level, polished, pulled into the square and parked under the jacaranda. People watched. The coronel's men, always polite, seemed almost celebratory in their discretion. Ana Clara went home and found her father, Joaquim, in the kitchen with the television low and a cup cooling in his hands. He had always been a quiet man, shop-worn grin, the patience of someone who had outlived many of his rivals. He folded his hands on the table as if clasping prayer. He understood what the suspension meant before she said it aloud, that men like Rogerio Montenegro could twist the apparatus to make a story stick, that a badge could be used as a bargaining chip in a town's private market. You did what you had to, he said, not wanting to inflame the wound but unwilling to lie. The tremor in his voice was the kind that makes you hear bones settle, not dramatic but irrevocable. He worried, not in big proclamations but in little ways, about her meals, about nervousness at night, about calls she didn't take after dark. The smear ate at him like a slow rust. 2 nights later, after the city's air had cooled and the house had grown very quiet, Joaquim bent over his phone to read a message from a cousin who had seen the paper. The message was a small thing, an image of the front page with an editorial note. "We told you they were trouble." Joachim's breath hitched. He'd always had a heart that obliged him with signals. He kept his health like a common good because others depended on his steadiness. In the morning, he collapsed, a small, quiet fall on the tile. The doctor's words, cardiac arrest, stress as a contributing factor, sat in the middle of their kitchen like an accusation.
No one could ever say, in a court of law, that the smear had killed him. Death was a complex thing. But grief has its own logic. The sequence of events becomes a verdict in the mind of those left behind. For Ana Clara, the succession was simple and lethal: public humiliation, bureaucratic stripping of honor, her father's collapse. The obviousness of it made her blood feel like a candle burning down. She did not scream. She stood very still and then pressed her palms to the kitchen counter, as if steadying herself for a long, measured response. At the funeral, the town's faces were maps of what had happened to them. Some were ashamed, some were not. Rogerio Montenegro's presence was a kind of punctuation. He arrived with a public conscience and left with small acts of condolence that read like contracts. Jonas, the newspaper editor, sent a wreath with a discreet card. Respectfully, it read. No one was surprised. Small towns rearranged their politeness to the shape of power. Grief did not, for Ana Clara, become vengeance. It turned into a sharpened resolve that moved the way a plan moves, quiet, meticulous, legalistic in intention. She understood that justice in that town would not come from the local prosecutor's office. It would not come from the same hands that fed the smear into papers and waited for applause. She had lost the badge, but not the tools of observation. The first human act of resistance was not grand. It was an exchange between two old acquaintances in a cramped shop where the air smelled of diesel and coffee. Antonio, who ran the grocery near the square, had kept a cheap security camera over his register. It had been there for years, not to spy, but to record petty thefts and the comings and goings of delivery drivers. The camera recorded everything that happened by the front door. When the tension rose in the market, Antonio saw more than just slaps and cigarettes. He saw the way men circled the source of trouble later that day, whispering. He kept footage. He had a folder of clips he rarely checked. When Ana Clara stopped in, because she always stopped wherever the ordinary people were, he looked at her as if weighing the shape of a risk. He handed her a small flash drive as if passing a relic. The plastic snapped in ordinary. "You should see for yourself," he said. His hands shook the way they do when a man says something he knows might cost him everything. She took the drive into her hands like something that could speak the truth aloud. She sealed it in an envelope, dated and signed the way a chain of custody requires in a courtroom, the kind of mechanical gesture she knew would matter later. She wrote the date on the outside in a bold, businesslike hand. Market footage, 1432. She entrusted the envelope to Ramos, a retired investigator who had the discretion of a man tired of choosing sides.
Ramos did not ask for payment in coin. He accepted a promise. If he helped, she would consider him an ally in ways that did not require his return to uniform. He slipped the envelope into a locked briefcase and carried it home. There were people who watched Ana Clara's small gatherings and called them foolish. They had heard the stories that people tell about anyone who rocks a town like a rocking chair in a place that needs its grooves. They said she had anger in her, that it would ruin her. They did not see how her anger had edges of method. Silva, a colleague who had supported her early in the town's clearinghouses, talked to the office on her behalf in small, public ways. How Ana Clara loved details, how she had come with a clean record. He offered what he could publicly without getting his own feet singed. But politics is an inevitable rot. Silva's words did not stem the current. The smear behaved like a tidal wave that also carried the scent of diesel and perfume. The local paper ran a second piece, this one more insistent, framing the slap not as self-defense, but as aggression against a young man with a promising future. Victor's mother, a woman polished and social, appeared in a photograph with a casserole for the family. "It's a shame about the bad behavior," a neighbor was quoted as saying. The narrative consolidated. She had used her authority to rough up the colonel's son. In private, Ana Clara replayed the market and the soft slow of memory. She felt the slap as if it had happened on loop. She did not romanticize it. It was a tactical claim made publicly because there was no other place to defend the limits of her body. She had expected pushback. She had not expected the civic machinery to be so swift at converting rumor into procedure. Her suspension came with the clipped courtesy of a government email and a polite clinical request to surrender her weapon and badge at the precinct door. She walked in and placed them on the counter like a surrender of something that had once been a covenant. "You'll be notified by the office," the lieutenant said. "It's standard, pending the inquiry." She left the badge behind and put a palm on the counter as if to feel some of the weight of it. It was not only a symbol of authority, it was also the town's promise that rules were enforced with impartiality. That promise, she knew now, could be hollowed by the presence of power.
After the funeral, people tried to say the right things. Some did, many did not. Ana Clara moved through their words like someone moving through fog, present but only just. Grief does not always roar, sometimes it plans. Alone in the dark of the days that followed, she thought in the precise syntax of a person assembling proof. Who saw, who recorded, whose hands could be trusted. It was the language of her training, evidence, chain of custody, corroboration. It steadied her like a ladder against a wall.
She called Leo, the waiter at a restaurant where town secrets tended to leak with the coffee. He was young and desperate enough to need the money, worldly enough to know how men like Victor talked in private. "I can get something," he said, voice low, "but it's risky." He promised an audio, an offhand recording of Victor boasting after the market, the sort of thing you say when you think no one is listening. Leo asked for compensation and for discretion. Ana Clara agreed. There was no poetic courage in that exchange, only necessity. And then there was the matter of the phone calls. The second kind of evidence would be records. She could not, legally and practically, demand phone logs as a suspended officer. That was where Ramos's old connections mattered. A friend in the regional prosecutor's office, one who had been a colleague before bureaucratic caution had made careers safe, could file an official request for records if there was cause to suspect collusion. The death of her father, coupled with the high-profile nature of the case, gave the prosecutor plausible grounds to move. Ramos was not a miracle worker, but he could thread the needle where procedure allowed. He worked cautiously, making a qualified request that would pass the scrutiny of rules and auditors. Calls between the coronel and local officials during the week of the incident. It was a slow, institutionally sanctioned move, but it was necessary. If the town's attempt to bury the truth had a particular rhythm, post a lie, let the bureaucracy act, sweeten the circle with social niceties, then Ana Clara intended to create a counter-rhythm, legal, methodical, public when necessary. She would not accept a trial by gossip. She would not win with equal measures of fear. She would win by making sure that when the narrative shifted, it did so on the basis of recorded fact. The first recorded fact sat in a plastic drive and smelled faintly of Antonio's cold sweat. One evening, after a silence that felt like a bated breath, Ana Clara and Ramos sat in his living room with the drive between them. A lamp painted the room an exhausted yellow. Outside, a truck's brake sang. Inside, a teacup vibrated with quiet intensity. Ramos knocked the drive gently onto his palm and looked at her. "We don't show it to anyone yet," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had seen towns bend and wanted to see if they would break. "We get it authenticated, chain it properly, and then we decide the forum. The press can be a tool or a danger." She listened. She had learned early that evidence had weight not only because it proved something, but because it could be handled badly. Documents in the wrong hands get twisted. Footage shown without context becomes theater. She nodded and folded her hands like a person learning a prayer she would never say out loud. She watched the footage alone for the first time in the kitchen where her father used to boil water. The image grain filled the screen.
The camera angle was narrow, a rectangle capturing the entrance of the market, a jerk of a world from one static vantage. In the clip, Victor's movement was not theatrical. It had the clumsy finality of a man used to taking liberties. He reached past a woman buying tomatoes, slid his hand toward Ana Clara's back, and leaned in with a presumption of familiarity. She pushed him back once, 3 seconds that the camera compressed into the quality of truth. Then she slapped him. The slap on screen was small, a sound that the camera was not meant to capture, but the body language before the slap, Victor's hand leaving the space of ordinary decency, was undeniably the aggression the smear had inverted. The grain of the image recorded the truth in a way that the headline did not. She replayed it until the picture blurred. Each replay etched new understanding, angles, distances, the presence of witnesses who had shifted toward the edges. The footage did not speak about the months of whispers, the perturbations of influence, or the weight of the colonel's money. It only spoke clearly about the incident itself. It did not undo the suspension. It did not bring back her father, but it offered a pivot. Ramos wrapped the drive in evidence tape as if it were something delicate and dangerous. He labeled it with the place and time of retrieval and his own name as custodian. These were formalities, and in the kind of town where optics meant survival, they were armor. "We go slow," he said. "We make sure every move we take is defensible." She felt fury bud and then settle into purpose.
"I will not let them get away with writing the story," she told him. It was a private thing, not a vow shouted into the town square, but a small contract with herself. "I will not let them take his dignity and call it law." Word traveled the way rumors do, like smoke that is both accidental and intentional. There were men who came to the paper to complain about the editor's handling of the first article. An offhand comment at a neighboring town's cafe was picked up and folded into a larger conversation. Social media, where the hearts on a post make and unmake reputations, began to pick up an undercurrent. Hashtag "Who is Ana Clara" kinded like a question, then a statement. It made people choose sides. Jonas, the editor who had allowed the original piece to be printed with its convenient innuendo, held his ground in public, polite and contractual. In private, his hands shook when the phone rang with people wanting context. He had friends, and friends have a way of turning protective calls into strategic caution. But his byline did not keep the footage quiet. It could not once the drive had an audience that could authenticate and expose. Not everyone believed in the moral arc of history. Many believed in the safety of keeping their mouths shut and letting the powerful dictate the script.
But even the most entrenched systems have a weak point, the court of public opinion, when it aligns with irrefutable fact. That is what Ana Clara was beginning to understand. A public with access to clear images and records could force the machinery that had been weaponized to re-examine itself. She began to assemble a plan that balanced procedural integrity with the necessity of bypassing local complicity. The press conference would be later. She had not yet decided the venue. For now, she concentrated on the first steps: authentication, additional corroboration, the slow acquisition of records that, together, might not only rebut the smear, but pin down the chain of influence that had produced it. That night, she placed the sealed drive in a sock drawer, beside receipts and a photograph of her father smiling on the stoop of their old house. It felt like an act of burial and of safeguarding at once. She slept poorly and dreamt of two hands, her father's and her own, passing a baton across a river. It was a dream with a law to it. If you want truth to travel, it must be carried carefully. Morning came with ordinary noises. The town continued to trade in small cruelties. A white pickup rolled down the street, and someone in the cafe laughed too loudly. But the market's geometry had changed. Men who once lounged in complacency sat with their backs straight, looking at the space where the slap had happened, as if a memory had been painted there. Her phone buzzed. Silva, short and practical, offering what support he could. Ramos texted a time to meet. Leo sent a short, clipped message. He had something, he said. The phone records request was filed by the prosecutor's office. Beefed-up interest from state-level officials meant there would be watchers above the town's petty horizon. It was slow and bureaucratic, and exactly the sort of process that Ana Clara respected. She met Ramos in the dim back room of a diner, booth number 4, where the motor oil picture on the wall had peeled in concentric circles, like a diagram of time. Ramos's hands were steady, his eyes the color of tired honesty. He slid a small legal pad across the table with names on it: witnesses, potential allies, vulnerabilities. He spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had learned to survive by making documents matter. "Antonio's clip is concrete," he said. "The prosecutor has opened a preliminary review after they were alerted to potential tampering by a party with influence. That lets us ask for records without seeming to manufacture a storm. The logs will take time, but they'll be valuable if they show contact between the colonel's number and local officials the morning after the paper hit." She listened. It was not a perfect path, but it was a path that would meet the law at its own terms. When she left the diner, the town looked different, less like a place that had already decided, and more like a place where decisions were still being argued. People she had waved to earlier looked her in the eye and could not look away. Some stared as if hoping to see whether the suspension had broken her. Others saw a woman who had been grieved and who was now, quietly and dangerously, assembling the paperwork of accountability. Ana Clara went home and sat before the television she'd unplugged for a week. She took the flash drive from the sock drawer, felt again the texture of its cheap plastic. She did not press play alone this time. She called Ramos and asked him to come. Chain of custody matters to the way evidence behaves in a court of law and in a court of public opinion. She would not let them twist the story to fit the coroner's needs by omitting the footage or by claiming it was doctored. She would make the record clean. Ramos arrived like a man with a plan, not a hero. He carried with him the legal weight of a request already made to the regional prosecutor. "We move carefully," he said again, but the words had a new edge. It was not only about proving what happened that afternoon in the market. It was about proving the atmosphere that made the smear inevitable. It was about showing how words, pictures, and power could be latched together to destroy a life,
and how those instruments could be taken apart when someone bothered to document them. They watched the footage together. The camera's grain made every face a study in light. There were no loud moments, only the obviousness of the act of being in someone's space, and then the simple, unassuming assertion of refusal. The slap was neither theatrical nor criminal in the way the headline would have it. It was defensible. It was human. When the clip ended, the room held the quiet of people who have seen a truth revealed, but know the battle for its acceptance has just begun. Ramos sealed the drive again, wrote a notation on his pad, and slid a lighter across the table like an exclamation mark. "We'll need more," he said. "Phone records, a voice, corroboration." He tapped a pad with a pen as if ticking off steps. Ana Clara sat back and felt, for the first time since her father's death, a small return of something like forward motion. The grief did not soften, it sharpened her sense of what needed to be done. The town had tried to write a story where she was the villain and her father the collateral. She would not allow that narrative to stand without contest. But she also knew the rules: evidence, custody, method. She would proceed as a detective, even when the badge had been taken. Outside, the jacaranda shed a leaf that slid along the windshield of a parked car. Inside, she and Ramos began to map names and times, possible witnesses and safe places. Leo, she learned, had a nervous energy and a tape player. Antonio had cameras and courage. Silva had an official voice that could be used in public without immediately becoming suspect. Each small ally was a thread that, woven together, might become a net.
She understood with a clarity that felt almost cold what the stakes were. Not just her reinstatement, not just a retraction by a paper, but the integrity of the town's institutions. If a coronel could manipulate a suspension, then a citizen's trust in law was an illusion. That was the thing she could not bear. Not for herself, but for the others who had no platform and no way of proving the truth when the powerful made one for them. Before they dispersed, Ramos said something that was not a plan but an ethic. We expose the facts. We let the law do what law can. We avoid the theater they love. It was, plainly, the best they could do. There were no dramatic promises about swift vengeance. There were instead the quiet measures of someone who had studied how systems break down and how they might be rebuilt. When she locked the house that night, she placed the envelope with the evidence into a small box and slid it under a loose board in the back of her closet, the sort of place a person uses to hide things that are meant to resurface rather than to disappear. She lay awake and counted the hours like the steps of a long career. She knew the next days would be full of small, important acts: phone calls to lawyers, meetings with the prosecutor's office, protection for witnesses, and arrangements with neutral venues. She had to keep the moral compass pointed toward accountability, not spectacle. Outside, a truck's tired engine hummed like a distant animal. She imagined the coronel in his house, thinking he had won. She imagined Victor, his face half emptied of its careless charm, beginning to understand that not every story remains his to write. But she also imagined the faces at the market: vendors, old men on benches, women with children at their hips, eyes watching her like a sort of jury. She thought of her father's hands and how steady they had been when he taught her how to count register receipts. The loss would not be undone, but it had taught her a lesson she would now put to work. She did not know yet how the town's machines would respond when presented with footage, documents, and a voice that confessed. That part of the story lived in the future. For now, she had a playbook partway written. Authenticate the visual, secure the documentary, coax the audio out of its hiding place. Each piece would be a proof of a larger pattern, and if the town had thought to hide the truth behind the roar of its word-making, she would be the one to turn on the lights. She pressed her palm to the photo of her father on the stoop and whispered words as much to herself as to the quiet house. "I will make them reckon." Not with fury, but with the work of proof. Outside, the town slept around the argument they had made and the argument that had yet to be made against it.
Inside, evidence sat in a plastic drive and a man's legal pad, and a woman who had been suspended for doing what she felt right breathed in, studied herself, and began the methodical climbing back toward the truth. If you want to follow this fight for justice, stay with the story. They moved with the patience of people who knew time could be a weapon or an ally. Days turned into a soft, precise cadence of appointments, phone calls, and the low hum of waiting rooms. Ana Clara learned the shape of patience in those hours, how to let a prosecutor read a file until his face betrayed curiosity, how to let a technician run the same clip 3 times because the needle of doubt in another mind needed friction to catch. The first real victory was small and quiet. At a regional forensic center, a young analyst with a ponytail and tired eyes sat with the footage loaded on a monitor and an array of software she considered routine. She checked metadata, timestamps, and the camera's native file structure. The result was not a dramatic pronouncement so much as a ledger entry. No evidence of tampering, original timestamps intact,
camera clocks synchronized to a time server the morning of the incident. The analyst wrote it down in a formal note and stapled the printout to the case file. That note, official and procedural, felt to Ana Clara like iron in her palm. They did things the way law expected them to be done. Ramos delivered the sealed flash drive to the regional prosecutor's office under a formal chain of custody form. Antonio signed his name in a small, cramped script. Ramos signed. The prosecutor initialed. Each signature was a line in a slow, living contract with truth. These pages would matter later when men like Rogerio Montenegro tried to claim a fabrication. The phone logs arrived less quickly. The request moved through channels, flagged as consequential because the prosecutor could say there was a credible complaint of collusion between a prominent local figure and municipal officials. A judge, an impartial, professional balance in a system that could tilt, granted access to call records for a defined week, the few days before and after the market incident. When the spreadsheet of numbers came back, it read like a map: timestamps, durations, call directions. At first, it was only a tangle of digits, but Ramos's eye cut shapes from them. There were calls at odd hours, a sequence of short conversations between a number that matched the coronel's registered line and numbers belonging to a municipal delegate, the local paper's office, and a certain private line that belonged to a political fixer known for arranging favors. The calls clustered on the morning the doctored photograph appeared in print and in the hours that followed. "You see how they line up?" Ramos said, tapping a pen along the paper. "Not every call is a conspiracy, but patterns are not luck."
Ana Clara read the logs and felt her chest tighten with a familiar professional exhilaration. Facts connecting in a way that made motive visible. It did not prove the coronel had called the editor and said, "Print this," but it did show a rhythm of communications that demanded explanation. For the first time since Joaquim's funeral, she let herself feel something like momentum. The audio arrived in a different register, jittery, small, and intimate. Leo gave it to her with hands that could not hide the tremor of relief and fear. He had recorded Victor after the market, when the young man, full of the rancor of entitlement, had boasted to friends over drinks. Leo explained quietly that he had kept the recording on a private file, afraid to bring it forward until he felt protected. "I heard things," he said, "and I couldn't sleep. I thought if I had to say anything, someone would use me." He passed her a small digital recorder, and then, like a man who had just stepped into light, he left, his face pale but resolute. The audio was grainy. Victor's voice was green with the smugness of someone who believed in the impunity of wealth. He laughed, and the laughter sat under the words like a sound that cheered pain. "She slapped me," he sneered, "and then they ran that picture. Perfect. My dad does things." He spoke of the paper as if it were a toy he could set in motion, of phone calls that would make things happen. He joked about how certain moves could break someone. In another breath, he celebrated the news of Joaquim's collapse with a callousness that made the recording feel small and monstrous at once. It was not a legal confession in the strictest technical language, but it was a mosaic of admission and attitude. It revealed the sentiment behind the orchestration. Ramos took the recorder to a court-approved custodian and logged it. He did not pretend that a single audio clip could do all the work. Instead, they built a narrative of accumulation. Footage, logs, voice. Each piece bolstered the others. The audio gave motive and tone. The phone logs gave a scaffold of contact. The footage refuted the initial claim that Ana Clara had overstepped. Together they suggested something larger, a pattern of influence used to manufacture a story that would kill a man's reputation, and with it, in the fragility of a body already tired, perhaps his life. Not everyone acted with the quiet righteousness of a prosecutor's filing. The town's response hardened. Men in suits began to appear in the market with faces that read like legal disclaimers. A delivery truck lingered too long outside Antonio's grocery. Someone spray-painted a thin, menacing streak on his back wall, a message more about intimidation than content. That night, a break broke the shop's front window. No one was hurt. The break was a message that said, "Keep quiet." Antonio's hands trembled when he told Ana Clara and Ramos. "They came by asking questions," he said, voice small.
Asking if I had seen anything, if I was sure, making me feel stupid. He pressed his palms together, the way people do when they are about to ask for a benediction they do not expect. "I'm scared," he said, "but I couldn't let him be the one to say the story without—" He stopped, and the rest was emotion too small for words. The tactic of the colonel and his entourage was old and simple: make the cost of speaking higher than the cost of silence. They understood social leverage in ways a law book does not account for. The response required not threats but protection. Ramos and the prosecutor arranged for Antonio and Leo to have contact protection, to be interviewed at secure locations, their statements logged, anonymity maintained where necessary until the day of the reveal. They were not heroes in a movie. They were ordinary people who had done an extraordinary thing by keeping their records and then trusting a suspended detective with them. Ana Clara never forgot that. The next step was a matter of public choreography. Ana Clara was not naive about spectacle. She knew that the press could be a dangerous altar, but she also understood that the press could be the only neutral forum left in a town where official channels favored the powerful. They would pick a place that could not be bought by local interests, a chain hotel in a neighboring city with a conference room and a contract that made eviction unlikely. They arranged time, access, and a tight guest list that included regional journalists and a few national reporters with reputations for stern, verifiable reporting. Ramos insisted on sending confidential invitations, proof that the story was not a leak but a formal exhibit. They rehearsed the sequence in the dim of a rented room with a projector and a borrowed laptop. Ana Clara wrote the order down on index cards. The plan was as simple as truth itself. Show the footage first to let images establish basic facts. Then display the phone logs and annotated slides to trace the network of calls. Then play the audio, unadorned, in full, to reveal attitude and intent. A prosecutor would then step forward to explain the legal steps the state would take in response to the evidence, preliminary probe, potential warrants, and temporary seizing of assets if necessary. They would emphasize that the press conference was not a trial but an act of transparency. There were practical anxieties to manage. Could national outlets be convinced to come? Would the moderator be impartial? Would the colonel have time to insert delay into the machine by filing counterclaims? They hedged against these things by timing. The press conference would be on a weekday morning when national desks were alert, and a legal representative from the state attorney's office agreed to be present, not as a performer but as a witness to the material's legitimacy. The morning of the press conference, Ana Clara woke with a kind of volcanic weariness.
She walked to the kitchen and touched the photograph of her father mounted on the fridge, a domestic icon that had become a lodestar. She did not perform theatrics. Instead, she dressed in a plain blazer, professional, unostentatious, the way someone expects the world to look if they are asking it to remember its rules. Ramos met her at the hotel entrance with a manila folder. He had dark circles, but a steady step. They entered the conference room with the evidence tied to their chests like armor. The room hummed with the polite anticipatory noise of put-together notebooks and cameramen making last adjustments. Credit cards clicked, remotes rechecked. National reporters circulated with a professionalism that felt foreign and, at the same time, like relief. The weight of being watched by people who hadn't swallowed the town's narratives made the air grayer and more focused. Ana Clara spoke first, not from a script but from a kind of moral ledger that had been written in the last reign of grief. Her voice was even, set on the edge of spare. "I was suspended after a doctored story," she said. "My father died soon after. We brought footage, call logs, and a recording to the state prosecutor. We are here to make those records public and to ask for an impartial investigation." She did not plead. She stated facts arranged like evidence in a brief. Then they played the footage. The projection filled the wall, a rectangle of grain and life. The market came into the room again. The way the seller's arms moved, the way the sun made a sharp line across a tablecloth, the moment of the second incursion into her personal space. Men leaned forward. A camera hand made a tiny sound. The grain of the image forced the room to confront the literal sequence of events, and a collective intake of breath marched like a tide across the faces present. Next, Ramos walked the room through the phone logs. He had prepared annotated slides that traced calls and timings. The pattern was not conspiracy drawn with rhetorical flourish. It was a table with numbers and arrows. "These calls," he said, "suggest a coordination of conversation between a prominent local figure and municipal officials and the newsroom of the paper the morning the doctored photograph ran." He did not declare motives. He presented pathways. The reporters wrote, their pens making small, conspiratorial songs on their pads. Then came the audio. Ana Clara did not need to play it loud to make it devastating. Victor's voice came through the speakers, raucous, unfiltered, small, and monstrously intimate. He spoke in the way entitled men speak, light and cruel, gauging a joke against a life. There was a line in the clip where his laughter crumbled into a sentence about getting results, about how a man like that would stop murmuring after the paper did its work. The sound was not an objective prosecutor. It was a moral instrument that revealed what he thought of consequences. The room shifted.
Key reporters looked at one another. One of them, a lanky woman with a recorder clipped to her collar, ran her thumb along the edge of her notebook as if feeling the heat of a story's surface. Cameras burned and feeds streamed. Social media, which is always waiting for something to be ignited, became the oxygen of the moment. Hashtags flickered. Live segments cut in with low, measured introductions. "We're following a developing story.
Evidence presented in a small town alleges collusion between a powerful family and several local officials. Within hours, the story leapt past county lines and into national feeds. The prosecutor's office issued a statement acknowledging the materials and announcing the opening of a formal inquiry. The language was careful: preliminary review, evidence submitted, investigations underway. It was not a pep talk or a victory lap. It was a procedural drumroll that required more steps. But the drumroll carried weight when the public heard the sound of images played, logs displayed, and confession recorded. The fallout was immediate in shape if gradual in legal consequence. Journalists asked the hard questions the town had been organized to avoid. What role did the editor play? Who asked the press to run that photograph? Was there a direct instruction from powerful hands? Under pressure, Jonas took a call from an investigator and found the formality of law less forgiving than the persuasive power of a colonel. He offered what he knew in the form of memos and email chains. In a sealed interview room, he signed a statement that described pressure from unnamed sources and anxiety over losing advertisers and political favor. He did not admit that he had run the piece for any reason other than the line on a page. He described how fear and the town's social economies had seemed more urgent than verifying a photograph. His arrest did not occur that day, but his detention pending questioning, an outcome of the prosecutor's ability to show probable cause, sent a message that the town's old immunity had been punctured. The delegate who had quickly called for Ana Clara's suspension found himself the subject of scrutiny as well. Call records placed him in conversation with the colonel during crucial hours. He was suspended from his municipal post pending the investigation, the irony of his earlier swift action not lost on those who remembered the surrender of her badge and gun. The public prosecutor obtained ex parte orders to freeze certain municipal communications, limited intervention, calibrated to investigative necessity. At each step, the language remained legalistic and precise. Taken into custody for questioning, subject to investigation, detention for potential obstruction. It was accountability in its procedural close, not a vengeance parade. That restraint mattered to Ana Clara.
The coronel's reaction could be read in the small, human ways of a man startled by the possibility of losing the stage he had ruled. He accepted handshakes in council rooms with the same practiced smile, but began to avoid the market. He took fewer calls in public. His son, Victor, was detained and questioned. The mood of his face when brought to the investigative office was not rage so much as bewilderment, an entitlement stunned into the realization that influence might, after all, have limits. In the town, the social calculus changed. People who had once ducked their eyes when Ruggiero passed lifted their heads. The shopkeepers who had seen bricks fly at Antonio made small gestures of solidarity. Someone brought an extra roll of tape for the broken window. Another offered to cover shifts so the shop could avoid being empty. Fear did not evaporate, but a new, cautious courage threaded itself through the market benches. When Ana Clara walked through the square, people looked at her not only with suspicion or praise, but with something of both. Curiosity sharpened into civic participation. There were consequences that did not read like headlines. Joaquim's grieving absence did not reverse. Ana Clara carried his silence inside her as both sorrow and a moral fuel. To the townspeople, she was for a short time an object of both admiration and debate. Some praised her courage publicly. Others whispered that she had used the press to bypass the system. Ana Clara did not spend time satisfying those who wanted her story to be smaller than it was. She had never sought celebrity. She sought accuracy. Yet she had to reconcile that the process she had chosen, a public reveal, was messy and contested. The ethical friction still snagged her. Ramos reminded her, gently, the town had given her the tools of her trade, and then allowed them to be misused. Using the press was not a renunciation of law. It was, in the absence of impartial local mechanisms, a way to create public pressure for formal legal scrutiny. The prosecutor's office, armed with authenticated footage, call logs, and corroborating audio, petitioned for limited warrants. Investigators executed the orders with a policy of restraint meant to avoid the appearance of a vendetta. They entered the newsroom to copy servers and emails. They subpoenaed records from the municipal office. These were not instantaneous triumphs. They were legal steps that required justification and hours of paperwork, and the careful instructions of judges who rotated through the case with the measured detachment of institutional process. Jonas, the editor, was taken in for questioning and later detained on charges of participating in a defamation scheme, charges that, in the fiction of this town and in the sober language of a prosecutor's report, read like a betrayal of journalistic ethics. He looked like a man who had spent a lifetime negotiating compromises and now found the cost written in ink and statutes.
When the coronel and his circle found legal doors closed and their private networks exposed on paper, the cracks showed in other ways. Key allies withdrew public support. Advertisers quietly reassessed their relationship with the newspaper. A state-level oversight committee issued a temporary restriction on the municipal delegation's actions.
The town that once seemed impermeable experienced the discomfort of accountability. People whose identities had been wrapped in a patronage system felt the chill first. The moment of reinstatement came 3 weeks later with the thin, bureaucratic courtesy that honors rules and saddens hearts. A formal order revoked Ana Clara's suspension pending the formal conclusion of investigations. Her badge and gun, symbols that had been gathered from her with a clinical politeness, were returned in a quiet office. The lieutenant who handed them back did so with a softness that suggested he had witnessed the moral contours of the town changing and had, in private, felt something like shame. She touched them both, the badge's cool metal, the familiar weight of the gun. They were not tokens of a restored life. They were instruments of duty, returned to her because evidence and public pressure had forced a system to remember its procedures. She pinned the badge onto her chest in the old way, the cold press against her sternum, the click that said this instrument belonged to a person who had never wanted it for its power but for its promise. She did not let herself weep in front of colleagues. She had the composure of someone who had learned the arithmetic of grief and action. There were small celebrations, coffee poured by friends, a few embraces that tasted of relief. But she also carried the knowledge that legal battles would ripple outward for months. Charges would be argued, and courts would move in their slow, exacting rhythms. There would be hearings and motions, and the dull work of depositions. Wins in a headline did not guarantee the finality of a verdict. Ana Clara knew how the law could be patient and implacable, and she also knew how messy public accountability could be when stacked against entrenched wealth. The town's institutions adjusted. A newly appointed oversight team from the state's attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the alleged collusion. Prosecutors requested a review of local hiring practices and the informal lines of influence that had allowed a photograph to become a weapon. Meetings were held with cautious agendas. The council chose, finally, to open a conversation with citizens about transparency and the separation of powers. Change, the kind that mattered, would arrive in small municipal policy wins: clearer protocols for dealing with allegations against officers, stricter standards for newsroom sourcing when public figures were involved, and a municipal commitment to protecting witnesses. These were not sweeping reforms.
They were, however, the kind of halting steps that could change how a single town handled the balance between power and rule. Ana Clara stood in courtrooms as a witness in hearings that smelled of paper and coffee. She read depositions, watched subpoenas be collected, and learned the procedural dance of attorneys who argued in syntactic precision. Seeing Jonas in a public corridor, watched by reporters, she felt no taste of triumph. He was a man who had made choices, some of them cowardly, and those choices now faced the exposure he had once meted out to others. When the coroner came to a hearing, photographed as if his presence in municipal corridors were an act of defiance, Ana Clara felt a complex coil of things: a satisfaction that the law had the power to subpoena, a sorrow for lives wasted in greed, and a melancholic understanding that institutions are human things, malleable and thus fragile. In private, she kept small rituals for Joaquim. On the first evening after reinstatement, she went to the market and bought the same fruit her father had liked, then walked to his grave. The cemetery was quiet, a rectangle of wind and stone. She placed the fruit on his grave and spoke in a voice lowered to a hush. She did not demand miracles or pronouncements. "We did what we could," she said to the empty air, feeling the honesty of both the claim and its limit. She set her badge beside a vase and touched the cool metal to the headstone, as if testing whether his presence was as real as the copper. The badge felt heavy with everything that had passed through it: sorrow, accusation, defiance, method. Ramos visited sometimes, bringing files and charts, and an offhanded way of complaining about the quality of coffee in the prosecutor's office. Leo went back to waiting tables, but moved through the town differently, not proudly, but with a quiet steadiness. Antonio kept the roastery open, though he installed a new, less conspicuous camera for safety, and kept the old one in a drawer that now contained a small brass plaque with the words "Evidence" scrawled in black marker. Their lives were not restored to dulled versions of themselves. They had been reoriented by the price they paid. The legal process remained a slow machine. Jonas was indicted on charges related to publication and collusion. Hearings were scheduled and delayed by the glacial tempo of judicial calendars. The coroner and his circle were investigated, and in some cases, detained pending further inquiry. Victor faced an array of legal consequences for his conduct that ranged from administrative penalties to criminal inquiries, but in the interim, the most visible effect was the unraveling of the networks that had once given him impunity. None of these were instantaneous certainties. They were, instead, the beginning of a protracted adjudication of deeds done behind the curtain of influence. There were new tensions.
Some townspeople argued that an outsider, a city transplant, had summoned national attention that would disrupt a fragile economy. Others argued that the only way to save the town from its own rot was to refuse to accept that power could write law. Ana Clara listened to both because she had learned that being right and being wise are not always the same thing. Her patience had hardened into a principle: serve the law, not the crowd. But when the law is weaponized, use public scrutiny to reset the course of justice. Her return to active duty was not a ceremonial restoration to the person she had been. The badge fit, but the person who wore it had shifted. She walked smaller courtyards with new awareness. She encountered colleagues who were learning to be less casual about the power their uniforms afforded them. She trained younger officers in de-escalation techniques and in how to document interactions without assumptions. She recognized in them the same hunger she had once had, to render the world legible and just. Months later, the town's market reopened into a weathered but altered landscape. Some vendors returned with new wares. A mural went up on a side wall, commissioned by a civic group, depicting hands not as tools of patronage, but as hands meant to lift. The mural was modest and argued for something less than immediate justice. It argued for an ethic of care. People paused to look at it, then went back to their days. Change does not always arrive with banded trumpets. Often it arrives in repainting and in casual acts of courage made by those who finally believe their small acts can matter. Ana Clara never pretended the father she had lost could be brought back. No evidence could undo that absence. On an ordinary afternoon, she stood at the market stall where the slap had happened and watched a kid chase a loose dog. A woman across the way smiled without the careful stiffness she had worn before. A man who had once avoided eye contact with Ana Clara now nodded, small and sincere. The town had not become a utopia. It had become a place where accountability had begun to pry open doors that once closed too easily. There were scars. People who had been hurt by the smear found themselves having to explain the same facts to different officials. There were lawsuits and counterclaims, the kind of bureaucratic knots that take time and patience to untie. But there were also savings of dignity recovered. Antonio's grocery sold more oranges that summer, because neighbors bought them as if each purchase were a small act of solidarity. Leo kept a side recording job, doing small audio edits for a local podcaster who wanted to tell civic stories. Ramos drank his coffee black and watched meetings with unashamed pride in the people who had stepped forward. For Ana Clara, the job was not a vindication as much as a stewardship. She wore the badge as if carrying a fragile promise, not to punish the town, but to hold it to its own standards.
She accepted that justice in its full sense might always be partial, that legal remedies are often delayed and messy. But she also believed, with the kind of stubbornness grief can forge into practice, that the work mattered. On a late afternoon that smelled of diesel and citrus, she went to the small square where the market still held its rhythm. Vendors packed up and customers finished their bargaining. Ana Clara stopped at the bench where her father used to watch people pass and sat a while. The air carried the ordinary noises of a place that had been argued over and had finally been heard. She felt the afternoon press on the bones of the day and thought about the ledger of acts that had created the new reality. A shopkeeper who kept old footage, a waiter who pressed record, a retired investigator who trusted a promise, a prosecutor who opened a file, and a woman who would not let the story be simply rewritten. She did not pretend the town had been cleansed. Power does not surrender without a fight. But she had seen something change, the way an image could be authenticated in a lab, the way call logs could tie private phones to public outcomes, the way a recorded voice could reveal the moral weather of a decision. The evidence she had gathered had not merely vindicated her, it had reopened the possibility that systems could still work if enough ordinary people insisted on the rule of law. She left the bench and walked to her car, the weight of her badge a constant at her chest. She stopped at the cemetery on the way home. The sky had gone the color of old metal, and in that light her father's grave looked small and final. She placed her palm on the headstone, and then for no ceremony and no audience, she let the badge rest there a moment. Cool, indifferent, an object that had been both weapon and shield. She said quietly the words she had learned to say over the long months. We did what we could. I will keep doing what I must. Journalists would continue to follow the legal developments. The coroner's trial, if it came, would be measured in years, not days. In the meantime, investigations continued, and documents accumulated behind the slow gates of the courts. Ana Clara did not look for immediate closure. She had learned to sit with unfinished things, and to trust the work of process.
She also learned to hold small pleasures: a cup of coffee the night before a long shift, the sound of a child laughing in the market, the steadiness of a colleague who brings a spare notepad. The badge would not mend what had been lost. Joachim's laugh would not return. But in the exacting hours of ordinary work, responding to calls, mentoring new officers, listening to citizens, Ana Clara found a way to move truth forward. It was not a heroic arc that erased pain. It was a daily choosing to act within the shape of law, to keep evidence safe, and to ask for fairness when fairness was inconvenient.
Months from the day a doctored photo aimed to define her, Ana Clara stood in front of a small group of trainees in a room that smelled faintly of new ink and institutional hope. She talked about chain of custody, about the ethics of exposure, and about the ways a professional life can be both rigorous and humane. She did not speak of revenge. She spoke of responsibility. "I did not bring this into the light because I wanted someone to fall," she told them, looking at faces that glowed with the sharp hunger of beginners. "I brought it into the light because we have to remember what our instruments are for. They are not tools of favor. They are tools of fairness. When a system is used to harm, we must use the system to repair." When the lesson ended and the trainees filed out, one of them, a young woman, lingered and said, voice hushed, "I'm sorry for your father." Ana Clara looked at her and saw something more than pity there, a recognition of what courage cost. She smiled, a small thing, and said, simply, "Do the work right. That will honor him." On the walk home, Ana Clara passed the market. A child tripped and a vendor reached to steady him. Ana Clara felt, in that tiny, ordinary scene, the answer to a long, anxious question about whether the town could change. It would change, she knew, not because one woman had been vindicated, but because enough ordinary people had chosen, in small and ordinary ways, to keep records, to speak up, to refuse the petty economies that make silence profitable. The work would be long and incomplete, and often painfully slow, but in the end, if ends can ever be guaranteed, it would matter. She reached into her pocket, touched the badge through the fabric of her coat, and felt the cool, familiar press of metal. She had been suspended and bereaved. She had waded through a smear that had taken a father from her, but she also had evidence that mattered. She had faces who had traded fear for courage. She had the law, imperfect and human, moving in the direction of accountability. She had, against the odds, forced a moment of truth into the public record. She walked on, the market noises turning into the evening, and the jacaranda leaves painting the sidewalk with mottled shadow. In that worn, careful town, justice had taken an edge of light. It would not shine forever. It would need tending. Ana Clara understood that. She would come to work the next day and the days after that, badge on her chest, memory in her bones, and the unflinching civic faith that truth, when handled with care, could still be a kind of armor. If this story has moved you, if you think accountability matters and small acts of courage should be supported, subscribe for more. Share this with someone who cares about truth. Tell us in the comments what justice looks like to you.